Hi, my name is Lucy Taylor and I'm a member of staff in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University. Together with my colleague Dr. Jenny Mathers, we are going to be hosting your session on the US politics, the crisis of democracy in the USA. So I thought we'd start with a little introduction, warming up, thinking about democracy. And of course, democracy is underpinned by a series of values that we cherish. These values include the idea that people are free and that all people are equally valued. More values that we cherish are that people can influence how society works, that we don't have to just accept the status quo, that we can through democratic institutions and practices, change the world. And indeed that all people have an equal chance to represent other people, but also to gain positions of power. Now, with democracy, there are, of course, as you've no doubt been learning, plenty of institutions. And these democratic institutions play a central role in making democracy work. They play a role essentially by organising the political discussion. Yeah, they set the rules and procedures by which we go about arguing and contesting ideas or proposing new ideas as well. Institutions are important because they also guard against despotism. They guard against one person taking control and being authoritarian and quashing our voices, as it were. Another key institution of democracy are political parties. And political parties are important because they organise the opinions. So people who basically agree on some basic things cluster together in political parties, and those political parties can then stand for election and organise the kinds of discussion that is going on. Of course, essential to this are elections as well. And the elections are important because they organise our choices, how we choose who is going to represent us. But democracy is about much more than voting and the rules of the game, though, isn't it? On the one hand, of course, we have lobbyists. We all know about sort of the gun lobby in the United States of America, but there are many other lobbying institutions and organisations, from trade unions to business organisations and that kind of thing. But equally important are social movements. Movements like the Black Lives Matter, for example, movement. Movements like the climate change movements. These are organisations within society, within civil society, which mobilise and push a political agenda. It's also important, though, to think about society as well in terms of the democratic culture, because democracy, and here we come back to the values, democracy is not just about buildings and rules and regulations. Democracy is about how we relate to one another in society, and a key area for work is the development of a democratic culture and democratic human relationships. One of the things that's at the heart of this then is representation. And there are kinds of three dimensions of representation that I want to mention here. The first dimension of representation is as a kind of a delegate. That is when we, as a group of people, a community, choose one person to pass on our message that we want to be conveyed to a larger body. The second dimension of representation is representation as decision making. That is where we, as a community, choose somebody who we trust to make decisions on our behalf. So we sort of give up some of our agency in a sense. And sort of electoral systems are often a mixture of both delegation and decision making. There is another really important dimension of representation, though, and that's sort of linked to society, and that is substantive representation. That is the representation of a person who has similar experiences to me. In my case, similar experiences of being a woman, of facing sexism, for example, or for somebody who's had children, produced children. But there's more than just gender, though. Experiences, for example, of disabled people, people who are perhaps in wheelchairs, or people who are maybe blind or deaf. Having those people with those kinds of experiences in a representative body brings another dimension. It's the dimension of having experienced disability, the way that society sets up barriers and problems, and that then can be very important in shaping policy, in shaping political outcomes. And of course racism is very, very important too, but there are other dimensions of experience too that might come in. For example, religion, for example, LGBTQ people, and having their experience of living in society represented in the wider representative body. So representation then is something which links the institutions of democracy and wider society. For substantive representation, this leads to some really big issues emerging too. Issues like who actually gets to decide on policies about women, about disabled people, about people who've endured racism. Who gets to decide? It also raises big questions about, well, whose needs get to be prioritised? Whose concerns are at the forefront of people's minds when they're in the debating chamber? And, as I suggested, whose experiences then go on to shape policy? A key theme that then we want to explore in this issue, in this workshop, is the crisis of democracy. And the crisis of democracy, the way we're going to be looking at it, we're going to be looking at the institutional aspects and the social aspects. So in terms of institutional aspects, we might think about the electoral systems, for example. Are the electoral systems fit for purpose, or are they inaccurate and outdated, not fitted for modern society? What about the system of checks and balances that we're so familiar with when we're studying, for example, US politics? Very often these can lead to a kind of stalemate. Are the balances wrong in the checks and balances system? Yeah? Do they need to be looked at again? And what about two-party systems? Most of you will have been studying the UK system and the US system, which is dominated by two huge parties in both cases. But are these parties too broad? What about two-party systems? Are they really workable? Or do they just cram people with actually very different views into one political party? How workable are two-party systems? We then might also think about the social aspect in terms of the crisis of democracy. When we look around us, one of the things that's very often debated or discussed is the distance between ordinary people and an increasingly professionalised political class. It seems as if they are very, very distant from our experiences as ordinary people on the street? What about also other aspects, particularly the growing divide between the rich and the poor? We note this in both the UK and the USA. There's a big, massive divide growing and growing between the rich and the poor. How does that impact on the representativeness of democracy, and therefore call it into crisis when we see very rich people ruling over people who are not quite so rich? What about these questions also then of social representation that I was also just talking about, when we see that most of the representative bodies are male, pale and able? Yeah? So what about that question of social representation? That people can feel that they are not represented by that body of parliamentarians. How people feel about politics then is actually really important and can have a huge impact. On the one hand, it can lead to a very strong feelings of apathy and disengagement with politics. What's the point in getting involved in politics? My voice will never be heard. This kind of feeling. But it is also, this crisis of democracy has given rise to populism, and we've seen this all around the world, from Bolsonaro in Brazil to Trump in the United States of America, and also the rise of populism all across Europe and elsewhere. So if people feel that there is a crisis of democracy, very often they reach for a kind of strongman figure and start thinking, well, you know, if democracy isn't working, why not go for a strong authoritarian figure who can take us to the promised land, as it were. So what about the workshop itself? Well, there's the workshop itself. We have to wait and see a little bit, but I'll give you an idea about what we are going to be looking at. We'll start off by asking this question. What are the major challenges to US democracy today? So when you're preparing, you might have a think about what you think the major challenges are to democracy in the USA. Then we're going to focus on three particular aspects. The first is the event of the storming of the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. The second is the divisions within the Republican Party that particularly emerged when they were trying to recently elect a Speaker of the House of Representatives. This then is about a crisis of the political party, a crisis of the Republican Party. The third crisis, though, the third aspect we're going to be looking at is questions of society and societal divisions, focusing particularly on race, inequality, and the state. We'll end by asking another question that you might also like to think about in your preparations. Are these short-term problems, or is this much more of a systemic crisis? Does it require systemic change within the whole system of representation and democracy in the USA? Okay, here are a few sources. If you are a teacher watching this, we can email you a longer list of suggestions, but here are some. There's a few articles there that might be of interest to you, and a few podcasts that you might like to listen to as well. Okay, so it just remains for me to say diolch yn fawr iawn, thank you very much, and to leave you with a couple of pictures. The one on the left, of course, is Aberystwyth on a beautiful sunny day. The university is over to the left and is about 20 minutes walk from that seafront there, and this picture actually is taken from a hill that overlooks the town, called Consti. The picture on the right shows the International Politics building and some of our students walking in and out, again on a beautiful sunny day. Okay, we really look forward to meeting you all soon, and thanks very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you.